Many of our strategic decisions in chess come from the nuances of pawn structure. While the least valuable piece individually, the pawn is arguably the most important element of evaluating chess positions, because structure is what gives dynamic potential to all the other pieces. I'll begin by teaching some of the pros and cons of various pawn formations, and then we'll see how they can be applied to strategic thinking. In this position, black's f-pawns are doubled. The f6 and f7 pawns are on the same rank. That's called doubled pawns. If this were a middle game position, and black were castled kingside, then the doubled pawns would be a hazard to king safety, because of the open g-file and weak h6 square. In an endgame, white might be able to slip in and attack the unsupportable h-pawn. If the f6 pawn, on the other hand, were on g7, there'd be no way for white to penetrate. One way of forcing this type of structural weakness in your opponent's position can be seen here. Take a look. It's white to move here. Do you see a way to force the weakening of black's pawn structure? Excellent work. Here, the bishop on g5 pins the knight on f6. You can attack the pinned piece with knight d5. There's no way for black to prevent knight takes f6, g takes f6, after which the king will be a little less safe and the f-pawn's doubled. Let's say after knight d5, black plays the interesting move, knight a5. White's bishop on c4 is pretty active, and so black chooses to trade knight for bishop. A good idea. Notice that the bishop can't escape, because after bishop b5, then black can play c6 and cause problems. The bishop for knight trade is going to happen. White just has to decide how. A key principle with pawns is to take towards the center. We always want to improve the cohesiveness of our pawns and to increase central control. After knight a5, white has a tough decision. What would you play? That's not the best move. That's not the best move. That's not the best move. Good job. The best move is bishop b3. After black plays knight takes b3, what should you play? The best move is a takes b3, taking towards the center. Good job. Notice also now white's rook is opened up along the a file, and white's central control is strong. This particular example of doubled pawns, the b2 and b3 pawns for white, it's not much of a weakness. Now, on the other hand, if white had played c takes b3, things would be different. Suddenly the d4 square is wide open. It's a big weakness. It's an outpost for black pieces. It can't be defended by a white pawn. Going back, if white had, say, castled here, and allowed knight takes c4, d takes c4, he also would have been forced to take away from the center. So in this position, white had to decide how to trade bishop for knight without losing central control and without weakening the pawn structure. So bishop b3, knight takes b3, a takes b3, recaptured towards the center, and white has a good game. Also notice that in this position, after white makes the inevitable trade on f6, knight takes f6, g takes f6, bishop h6. While both white and black have doubled pawns, white's position is much better, because black's doubled pawns weaken his king, and white's doubled pawns weaken nothing. Let's return to a position we saw not so long ago. We saw that black had doubled pawns. Black also has what's called isolated pawns. Isolated pawns are pawns that are exposed on open files and cannot be supported by other pawns. Here we see that black's c and h pawns are isolated. You can imagine that if white were to have two rooks on the c file or h file, this could cause big problems for black. On the other hand, if that a7 pawn were on b7 and white were to have a rook on c1, then simply c7 to c6 would put up a wall. Isolated pawns also have the downside of leaving open holes within their own camp, in which enemy pieces can comfortably lodge. We'll see more on this idea on the weak squares creating outpost section to come. Take a look at the next position.